Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope you can. Welcome to this webinar. This webinar is entitled Migrating Legacy Applications to Public Cloud. Really, this webinar we're going to go through at a high level all of the things that you need to think about when considering how to take your legacy applications to a public cloud vendor. What are the areas you need to focus on, and what is the best way to actually get you to that end goal? So relatively sort of full content proposal that we actually have. So we're going to defer any questions really to email. So if you have any questions, please send them through to the email address that you see there after the webinar. More than happy to pick up on any questions that you might have. More than happy to explore in detail any further requirements that you might also have as well. So in this webinar, really what we're going to cover are a number of different areas really. We're going to understand what is it about legacy applications and their characteristics that can cause us to have to plan and look at them differently for migrating them to public cloud. We'll look at and understand what those migration drivers are as to why would you want to take that legacy application to a public cloud. And then also based on version 1's experiences and our understandings of our customers' needs, understand what are the common challenges you have around migrating those applications to a public cloud, and look at really what are the options you have in terms of where you can place those application workloads, and really look at what are the migration strategies and the principles that you need to follow, or that we'd suggest that you follow rather, in order to try and approach and plan for that migration itself. Finally, we'll end up with some very specific focuses on a couple of those challenges, and talk to you really around what are the mitigations that you should consider, and some of the strategies for helping you achieve that around areas such as licensing, cost, support, governance, and a number of those associated areas. So what we'll try to do really in this webinar session is really just to give you the building blocks, if you like, at a very high level across all the different flavors of public cloud. We're not going to focus on any one particular cloud, but really just to try to give you the considerations and the strategies and the ways in which you can approach moving your applications themselves. So first of all, really, what are legacy applications and what are their characteristics that you need to think about? Well, there's a number of different areas really. Legacy applications, enterprise applications, traditionally tend to be something that's embedded right at the core of your organization. They provide some kind of core business functionality, some kind of capability that really is essential to those enterprise workflows. That usually means that over time, particularly if they're long and well established, they tend to have become quite tightly hooked into your business processes, but also very often integrated in many other ways that you might normally not have envisaged. So through ad hoc applications or data sharing, through files and batch mode activities to other parts of the organization. As a result, that can make them quite difficult to replace and upgrade, and those replacement cycles tend to be quite long running and quite elongated and quite complex to both manage and also deliver. Those applications tend to be highly centralized. Therefore, they also tend to have a level of control around access to them that tends to mean that it's more difficult to move them in part. Usually, it ends up being having to move them in full. And because they are so centralized and so carefully managed, they tend to draw other applications to them to integrate, as opposed to supplying data out. So you'll often end up with a lot of point-style interactions, point-style integrations to those systems. And that only increases the level of complexity that you have around the integration. They therefore also tend to be slightly well-established technologies, maybe not the latest generation technologies, but they tend to be well proven and well mature, but they generally don't tend to be ones that would relate well to a cloud environment. So there needs to be some additional considerations as to how they function, what they do in terms of taking them on that public cloud journey. So in terms of what those characteristics might be, what those drivers for that adoption actually are, there's a few that we've listed here. Very often those enterprise applications tend to be the last applications that get moved, or they tend to be down the list in terms of the priorities for moving, simply because they are complicated and they have a level of interaction that requires a certain level of organizational focus. They tend to be driven, therefore, by a number of more strategic level factors rather than purely the technology. They're driven more by business numbers and by business elements. So that might be some form of strategic business and external change. That might be a need to to close a data center or to move the type of expenditure that you actually have from one place to another. It might also be to reduce the level of capital and infrastructure expenditure. It may be that there is a shift, that the infrastructure that it's currently sitting on has some end of life or obsolescent aspect to it, and therefore there is a need to shift that expenditure accordingly and to obtain that value for money from doing that. But generally there tends to be some wider sort of organizational push or strategy that's required, and very often it's also about making sure that the capabilities of that application are available to a much wider audience, and in a way that actually better matches the level of business insight that's needed. So usually that's in terms of better reporting or support for data on mobile devices or data in the field. It's actually widening up that area of access to those enterprise applications that often drives them to cloud, because you have that ready-made networking available. Also, often the organization itself isn't necessarily able to match to the pattern of provision that's required around enterprise applications in the same way that a cloud provider can do so. It obviously can't scale or flex in the same way, and sometimes it may not be able to meet the level of SLAs that are required without significant investment that it's not prepared to make. The fifth point you can see there around digital strategy and enablement. Very often these legacy applications tend to have critical data that is required by any digital programs or digital activities that are happening in an organization. So very often there is a need to develop a closer integration to that. Typically those digital applications tend to be cloud first in their nature and cloud driven in the way that they're actually provided. Therefore, there is a natural tendency to want to take your enterprise applications and adapt them and move them closer to those digital applications. Otherwise, you have networking and latency challenges that may creep in and may erode that user experience. So very often, these enterprise applications need to be moved as part of enabling a wider digital strategy. And latterly, really, they may also simply be there as a cost driver to drive cost out of what may be a platform that is being run towards the end of its life, or that has really little capability to add additional value in terms of functionality. Simply, therefore, is a need to move to a more utility or a commodity charging model that many public cloud vendors provide. So there's normally a number of reasons as to why these applications need to be moved, but very often the challenges that they have around that migration tend to be the same. So the challenges really for legacy applications are slightly different than for some cloud applications in some contexts, in that because they are so well established and because they are providing a core set of functionality, many business stakeholders are relatively reluctant to actually move them or to change them. Therefore, one of the challenges is actually building a suitable business case for that return on investment. Yes, you can build that with the cost reduction, but you need to actually be able to offer a level of digital transformation or a level of additional functionality or value that that platform can offer by being moved to the cloud. So I think one of the things that we would stress is you need to make sure you're building the right business case that isn't purely just based on technology, that's based on a wider business strategy. It may be that the data center is closing, but it needs to be offering something additional to that in order for those business stakeholders to want to invest in a platform that effectively may be doing just the same thing in the cloud. You really need to be looking to offer something additional to purely a lift and shift style activity by moving those applications to a public cloud. So it should enable something else to happen on top of that application to do that. Some of the other challenges really that we'll talk through as we go through this session are around the ownership and the governance and the compliance aspect, particularly if you work in highly regulated industries such as utilities and financial services. You need to ensure that the ownership and the governance aspects and the compliance that goes with that can be fully evidenced and demonstrated in the public cloud vendor context. Now, many public cloud vendors have high levels of compliance, but the compliance really comes about in terms of the way the application runs on top of the compliant platform. So as part of the migration, you really need to demonstrate that you are actually still maintaining those levels of governance and compliance. Enterprise applications, particularly legacy applications, also require probably the highest level of resourcing in an organization, because you need expertise in the existing enterprise application, but also expertise in the new technologies and the new cloud platforms that you're actually moving it to. That requires a much higher level of testing, a higher level of planning, a higher level of delivery resourcing than might be the case with some more cloud native or more digital style applications. So there's definitely greater demands on organizational expertise and the way that that's resourced and the way in which you engage with suppliers around that process and how that process actually moves. The nature of these applications also means that there is a high level of business impact on, and therefore continuity is essential with these applications. So there tends to be a very risk-averse approach taken often to delivering these, and that can slow down the rate of progression and also in some cases the ability to actually deliver a full-scale migration. Security is another major challenge. And there is definitely a need to focus on areas of security, both in terms of data, but also in terms of the ability to externally access those systems and making sure that that is put in place correctly. Many enterprise applications, particularly much older applications, may not be designed for a cloud security context. So there are certain things that you need to factor in and certain activities that you need to undertake in order to reduce that level of exposure. And the final point really is also very often the problem with enterprise applications, and those certainly those that are very well established and have been in the organization a long time, is you can discover what the actual application and the workload itself does, but very often the problem is actually what else is talking to it, what else is using it, all of those ad hoc integrations through Excel spreadsheets and reporting solutions that I'm sure we're all well aware of. Those things may also add additional levels of complexity and testing that's also required. The age of the application and the nature of how it interacts with its existing environment may also throw up some compatibility issues which you need to work through in that new public cloud vendor environment. Okay, in terms of looking beyond that, really just to look at, well, where would we move these cloud enterprise applications to? Well, some of you may have seen diagrams similar to this before, but public cloud vendor environments really tend to offer three types of environments, and they differ really from the traditional on-premise applications that you see in the left-hand set of blue boxes there, where you manage everything, or your private cloud vendor operator manages those for you. Really, there are three choices: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Software as a service generally doesn't tend to be suitable for migrating enterprise applications as they currently stand, because all of the elements of the environment, the software, the hardware, the data, the applications usually are fully managed by the public cloud vendor itself. And that's not normally something that really relates well to a legacy application in particular, or to enterprise applications, unless you are moving to a software as a service provided enterprise vendor, in which case the migration aspects don't really apply. So most migration of enterprise applications or legacy applications tend to be focusing on infrastructure as a service or platform as a service as the target public cloud vendor provider options that they're looking at. So those are the areas that really you need to be focusing on. Within that, really, it depends on the nature of the enterprise application or the legacy application that you have as to which is the most appropriate environment. A lot of that comes down to the specifics of the enterprise application and the ability that it uses to exploit underlying characteristics in the hardware. So if you have very high levels of storage requirement or need to have access to physical components in the actual server environments, your legacy application may be better suited to moving to an infrastructure as a service or variations thereof that are better able to support the requirements of that environment. Platform as a service only gives you control over the applications themselves and the data that you've built. It may be that you can use that with enterprise applications to provide a hosted database or a hosted application that forms part of the solution. But generally, unless you've built that solution as a platform as a service solution and are moving it from one cloud to another, platform as a service doesn't tend to be as applicable. You absolutely should consider it, however, because it may give you some cost advantages compared to infrastructure as a service. So really, with infrastructure as a service, one of the things to recognize is you are still actually having to manage a large element of that infrastructure estate for you. If you don't have those capabilities, that's where you need to look at other third parties and have advice and guidance around how best to run and operate those in a public cloud environment. That's something that Version 1 has been doing with a large number of our customers, and obviously happy to help in that respect. So really, we're talking about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service as the targets to consider. In terms of how you actually move your enterprise applications and your legacy applications to those target cloud environments, what we put on the screen here really are a series of options, really. I wouldn't say that they're exclusive alternates to each other. It's really a number of ways in which you can move those applications to the cloud. And what you need to do really in terms of moving your enterprise applications is decide the best one for the particular application you have, particular purpose you're trying to achieve. In some cases, you may be able to move those legacy application or enterprise applications really just incrementally, either by organizational unit or by territory or by country, and simply just move through the applications, assess what you have, and incrementally move them to a public cloud vendor. Whilst that can be an effective way to do that, that really assumes that you have a certain commonality in all of the applications that you have. A better approach usually tends to be some level of assessment that moves them based on risk and priority, but also based on the level of interdependence that those applications have between themselves. So that's really an activity where you assess the risk factors, the impact factors, and deduce a priority from that in terms of when you're going to move them, how you're going to move them, and also on what basis you're going to move them. That also offers the benefits of being able to arrange the right resourcing and the right skill sets according to the right types of platforms and the right types of support you have there. Not all enterprise applications may be fully suitable to go to a cloud environment. Many are, but there may be some applications that are either simply too old or too complicated, or the level of cost and resourcing required is too great to actually take them to a public cloud environment. It is therefore often worth considering whether or not it's maybe better to look at either an alternate product from the same vendor, or to look at developing a brand new solution in cloud and migrating simply the data or some key business configuration information from the existing application to that new cloud platform. It really depends on therefore on what the new solution would offer that differentiates it from the existing solution. But I wouldn't rule out that idea of replacement in cloud and migrating the data if that offers you better advantages and better enablement. Another approach really is to decide that you're not going to decide on one particular cloud platform. You're actually going to use more than one public cloud vendor, and therefore you'll develop a universal platform or a blueprint that allows you to pick and choose which public cloud vendor is suitable for what type of workloads that you have. That allows you to build and optimize and get the most out of each public cloud vendor, and then move those workloads accordingly. And that requires a lot of upfront design, upfront expertise, but it may give you a level of flexibility down the line, as we'll see in the next few slides. The other approach really is to take one of what's called hybrid and edge, and that is really to decide there are certain workloads or certain enterprise applications that are either simply too sensitive, too complicated, or too costly to move. Therefore, we'll retain those on-premise or in our private cloud, but integrate them more heavily and highly to public cloud vendor platforms, and that'll give you a hybrid-based solution. It may be that some of those elements in your on-premise architecture or in your cloud architecture do some pre-processing before the data is moved to the other part of the applications, and that would give you a level of what's called edge capability, where you are filtering or pre-processing data before sending it on. That may require you or may involve you splitting an enterprise application into two pieces, and that may be a better utilization of that enterprise application in terms of a cloud context. The reality is that no one of those strategies is a universal for every scenario. So very often you'll find yourself mixing and matching between those different scenarios as to which is the most appropriate strategy and appropriate approach to take. On the next slide, really, we're going to give you some considerations around whether you move to a single public cloud or multiple public clouds for your enterprise applications, particularly for your legacy applications, which often have particular requirements. We divided this up really into two sort of segments, and we'll run through the advantages of single cloud and the advantages of multiple cloud, and then give you some comparisons across. Enterprise applications moving to a single cloud generally tends to reduce the number of things that you need to think about in terms of the security approaches you need to take. You're dealing with one set of technologies, one set of vendor capability. It often can be easier to target your security in a particular way and to provide a mechanism that that's easy to achieve. There tends to be reduced levels of integration because you're only dealing with one cloud, so your integration points tend to be less in number and tend to have more ability to design them in a standardized way. It also means that if you have a lot of your data and your applications in the cloud, you're not also having to move data backwards and forwards from one location to another. And that's particularly important with public cloud platforms, where you can be charged for data that is exiting or being moved externally from the public cloud vendor platform to another location, whether that's back to your existing organization or to another cloud. So those integration aspects can be very important from a cost basis, particularly if you're looking at using multi-cloud approaches. So there are cost optimizations you can get from using single cloud, because you may be putting a level of workload into those public cloud environments that allows you to get discounts or other forms of cost advantages. And the final point really around having a single cloud is you only have to perform one level of governance. You need one set of skill sets and one set of knowledge base, if you like, that you can use to manage those single cloud environments. And that can have definite advantages from a headcount and from a resourcing and from a organizational knowledge perspective. So single cloud definitely has some advantages. However, not all enterprise applications may fit to a single cloud model. It may be that the single cloud doesn't actually have all of the capabilities that you need for that particular enterprise application. There are certain applications that must have certain attributes and certain infrastructure support that they need, either so that they are continue to be supported by the vendor, or because they just simply need to have that in order to function. So you may only be able to get that by having more than one cloud that is where each application is matched to a particular vendor and a particular vendor type. A multi-cloud approach does also give you a level of balance in your suppliers, both in terms of the level of risk that you have with one supplier over another, and that may be a security risk, it may be a perceived commercial risk, it may be that you're in a particular type of business where you actually need to spread the activities that you do into different geographies and into different domains. Therefore, it's better to have it in multiple clouds because of a greater geographical coverage. A multiple cloud approach also can give you a better ability to innovate and transform those enterprise applications, because those technologies may be available more rapidly in one or more of the cloud environments, rather than having to wait for a particular vendor to deliver that. So there are a number of choices around single cloud or multiple cloud, but one of the things I would say is that you should only adopt a multi-cloud approach where there are good business justifications for doing so, because they do require a much greater level of governance, a much greater level of resourcing, a much greater level of skill set in order to maintain and complete those actual migrations. You are effectively multiplying the levels of activities by the number of cloud vendors that you have, but there may also be some very good reasons for doing that. So you need to understand, therefore, before deciding which cloud platform and whether it's more than one, what are the characteristics of your applications, what are the types of applications, and what else do you already have in cloud as to where that then may fit into your overall activity. There's a number of factors that version 1 have recognized in our interactions with moving customers to cloud in various different forms, and moving legacy and enterprise applications as well as part of that, that you should really think about in terms of what are the things to put in place in order to achieve that successful migration. One of the things that we found is that the more you can automate the process, the more repeatable you can make the process, the more you can take risk out of the activity, the more you can put speed and progression into that activity as well. The more you can therefore automate the deployments, the refreshing of those deployments, to an extent the testing, but also the more agility and more innovation you can put into that process, generally the better the outcomes tend to be. You do need to plan in advance a level of governance and flexibility in terms of what you want those public cloud environments to do and how compliant you need them to be. But you do need to understand that public cloud environments are different to on-premise. There are certain things you can and can't control. So there needs to be a level of flexibility in those governance approaches and be able to adapt to the advantages of cloud, whilst also giving you the governance and compliance that you need. There is a new requirement and a heavy requirement around deriving the right policies and the right processes and the right procedures to match that. So you should heavily consider all the ISO policies and procedures as part of that. You may need to change your organizational structure in a way to make the best use of moving to cloud. The less on-premise IT provision you have, generally the more you tend to be externally focusing in terms of the way that your organization works and its IT provision. Therefore, you need to develop capabilities in service management, contract management, and more around provision and brokerage of that provision as you develop as an organization. That requires a different kind of organizational structure. You're dealing with suppliers on a far more critical basis. So you need a focus around SLAs and of management of those organizations as well. And building those relationships is obviously vital to producing a good public cloud migration process. And I think the fifth and most important point really of all of those is that where we've seen this work best in organizations is those organizations that don't simply see this as a point-to-point activity. They're continually looking to gain improvement and to gain advantage by the migration and looking to build additional levels of transformation and value as part of the process that they deliver. So I think those 5 steps really will be a good starting point in terms of migration. There's some other points listed really here on these next 2 slides around some of the principles. I'm not going to go through all of the detail that's on the right-hand side, but really there is no substitute in public cloud migration activities really around planning and phasing, trying to look at doing things incrementally, but you really need to qualify everything before you move very heavily against not just what were the original SLAs and the original NFRs that the enterprise applications were built for, but what are the current needs, what are the current business drivers, what are the current business requirements. Those are the ones that you should be trying to satisfy in your public cloud migration. And those may not necessarily be the same ones as the enterprise application was built to. And it's key to recognize that and therefore to qualify very heavily what does the application now need in terms of what type of public cloud provision, because that may have a big impact on your cost and the level of effort you need to actually do to move those applications and whether they can be moved. As mentioned before, you should prioritize really based on the level of business risks, the impact and the dependencies, but be very granular in the way in which you do that prioritization. Understand the applications, understand also the level at which you can move those application elements and those elements of those solutions, not only just in terms of the technology aspects, but also what is the maximum level of parallel activity that the organization can sustain without that posing a level of business risk. So it's identifying what are the units of migration you can achieve and how best to put those in place. There is absolutely a requirement to understand what your current licensing position is, what your current support positions are, and what are the business and technical factors that currently drive those, and then try to understand what that might mean if you move those same applications to a public cloud context, because the licensing is not the same always in it for every vendor and for every application context. So it's key to understand what that might mean and to make sure you plan accordingly. Obviously, as mentioned before, compliance and security is a key requirement here. And really, you should be trying to move beyond just that initial lift and shift, as I mentioned before, and try to actually deliver a platform for future transformation and future digital strategy that allows you to deliver those additional things that the application may be able to offer. And that may mean a different architecture or a different way in which the application is built and runs, but one that stays within a risk profile that you're willing to accept. But that then avoids you having to rework the application as soon as you get it into that new environment. As I mentioned before, there are often a lot of cultural and organizational issues here. It can be a big change for certain organizations and certain business units. There is an element therefore of winning hearts and minds and understanding what the opportunities are in those new cloud environments. From a resourcing perspective, we'd strongly recommend that you build centers of excellence, that you do a lot of piloting and evaluation, and that you have that definition of the cloud governance in advance, so you understand what those targets are for those skill sets. And don't be afraid to partner when needed to. Often using a specialist partner, be that in licensing or in terms of the migration activity, can provide big cost savings and big time savings, because you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that you might otherwise not discover until it's too late within your own organization. And there are a number of areas where customers at Version 1 has helped in those respects, and I'm very happy to advise accordingly. Obviously, everything should be driven from a mitigation point of view. You're not trying to mitigate the risk. Therefore, you need to plan what you would do in the event of a failure of something to migrate, and create those strategies of parallel running and cutover and all of the things you would normally do from an upgrade process to actually make sure you mitigate that risk. Automate as much as you possibly can, because it will save you time, it will give you predictability, and there are capabilities in most public cloud platforms to allow you to automate almost every aspect of the deployment and some of the operation. Automation, it doesn't just stop at deployments either. Automation can help you with cost control because you can shut down test and development servers at certain times of days and night automatically, and that can help you with your governance and your cost control profiles. It's also key to understand what are the proprietary aspects of the data and of the systems that you've got, and try to reduce those proprietary elements where you possibly can. So if you have those in-house custom bespoke elements, it may be worth going through a pre-process of reworking those to make those more standardized so that they don't block the migration activity because there's something that simply won't run in a cloud context or is designed to work in a particular way. So in terms of a roadmap of activity really to try and get you to a public cloud environment, a number of things really that they've called out here for you. The first step really is actually agreeing the objectives and the measures. Why are you moving to cloud? What is it you're looking to obtain? What are the advantages you think you will gain from doing that? And therefore just try to understand how you will measure whether you've successfully achieved those or not. It shouldn't just simply be because everything else is going to cloud. You need to target it around the particular applications and the particular benefits to the business stakeholders who look after or own those applications or own the budgets for those applications. You need to inventory very carefully and understand what you have and build the appropriate elements and governance and policies around that, and then decide what are the right cloud targets, what are the right sizes for those applications in those environments, and make sure you actually have that in place. It may be that some of the support and licensing aspects can be mitigated by choosing the right size of platform, right size of instance to move to. Okay, so on the fourth step, really what we're talking about therefore is the actual migrate itself. And then the fifth step really is around the parallel running and the cutover, and then repeating and evolving that process until you've achieved the place where you need to be for that relevant application. And the final stage really is around about where you're managing and optimizing that application in a new cloud context. But what you're doing is optimizing it for the public cloud characteristics that it has and what it can now enable, as opposed to maintaining exactly the same configuration that it had in its previous location. Okay, we're going to look very finally, I'm just a little bit over time, but very finally look at some slides really around what are the specific approaches and mitigations that you need, and what are the common areas that here in version 1 we've seen with customers and with particular vendors that need to be addressed in terms of how you move those applications. And there are some fairly specific challenges, particularly around some of the ones that we'll go through in these next few slides. So the first one tends to be around licensing and support. Quite a lot of challenges really in the area of licensing and support, simply because a lot of these enterprise applications were either built or licensed or designed or architectured before cloud platforms and the separation of cloud platforms really was fully in place. Often some vendors perceive cloud platforms as some form of threat, or as a platform that's not suitable for their enterprise applications, or simply the age of the licensing you have just simply does not factor in cloud into the terms of the contract. What you may find therefore is that you therefore end up in a situation where the licensing is very prejudicial to moving to cloud, or some of the licensing is very specific and almost contractual in nature, and there are some destination platforms in terms of public cloud which a vendor may not support or does not want you to move to, and not all licensing may be transferable. So you need to be very careful in terms of understanding your licensing, understanding your obligations, and what you can take into a cloud environment and what you can't take into a cloud environment. Also bear in mind that it's not simply at the component vendor technology level. You may have a range of third-party solutions built for you by specialist suppliers that may have their own custom contractual terms and conditions. So really, in terms of trying to mitigate that, you should be looking at strategies where you're inventorying the license exposure you have. You need to bring that together into one unified place and one unified part of the organization that has all of the licensing knowledge, understands all of the licensing that's there. If you need to engage third-party licensing specialists to do so, then absolutely you should. But you need to understand what are the valid combinations that you can have in public cloud. Also understand whether you currently have support and what your current licensing position is, and whether or not some of those constraints are actually applicable to what you need. Do you need a lift and shift? Will that give you the licensing compliance that you need? Also, you should look at some third-party tooling options if that might preserve your support situation. If a vendor says it won't support you in a particular public cloud environment, there may be a third-party tooling option that will give you the capability, and you may be willing to trade off the support aspects for that. If your solution is already out of support, that may be less important to you. So really it's understanding what those red lines are, understanding what those trade-offs are, doing that right engagement with those specialist resources, but also in the design of the environments that you look to do, making sure you get the right size in terms of CPU and RAM in those server environments, making sure therefore that if the licensing is based on the number of CPUs that you run, that actually for the workloads you have the right balance between CPU and memory. If you have a very heavy memory intensive application and you don't need the CPUs, there is usually a server instance or a configuration in a public cloud environment that will give you that without increasing the number of CPUs that you need and increasing your licensing. There's a range of POCs and third-party mitigations and products you can use to actually look at those processes. Obviously, there are also third-party managed services around licensing and support that may also help you if you are moving to a situation with public cloud where you have to move, but you have a support aspect to that. So there's a number of avenues that you can look at around that. In terms of some of the other specific challenges, data is obviously a big challenge in moving to public cloud. And what do you do about the data that you have? How do you manage it? How do you actually understand what you have? Data often forms one of the major problems because the data platforms are never just existing on their own. They're always connected to something. And legacy data in particular is often highly integrated across the organization. It's usually constructed from multiple sources, or you have multiple sources going into a particular location. Often there's a lot of ad hoc desktop use of Excel spreadsheets and various other forms of reporting or processing that's not usually declared in formalized specifications and management scenarios. And there's a lot of hidden aspects therefore to this. And you need to understand therefore what those legacy applications are. There may be restrictions through the T's and C's in terms of sharing and availability of data and positioning of data as well. So really, you need to understand the data that you have and try to bring it into some kind of SLA-driven management process around bronze, silver, gold style SLAs, model that data usage that you have and model the duplication and the dependencies that are there and try to reduce those dependencies and reduce the duplication. Group and model the data by its criticality and by its priority. And then align those elements really and understand the impact of licensing on that if you're moving it to a public cloud, and then also understand what the connectivity aspects that you need that relate to that actually are. So it's really all around aligning those SLAs, getting the right size cloud provision, creating the right target databases, and then piloting and moving. And there's a lot of automation you can bring into that process, a lot of grouping and application of changes that you can make. And therefore a lot of automation of the process itself, which can save you time and cost as well. In terms of data and security aspects, we touched on some of these a little bit earlier on, but very often security in most enterprise applications is very internally focused, assuming that the outside is secure. It's very often specific to each particular system. There's often no centralized security register, a lack of role-based access control and auditing. Some of the data may be too sensitive for cloud, so there are challenges around how you split the data and how you deal and manage with that data. There are often compliance requirements such as GDPR that require you to overhaul that data, and the innovation aspects really get restricted as a result of the security things that you have. And many of the strategies really are around making sure that you have the right things in place prior to any move to cloud. So making sure that your user directories and your user security is correct, that you have the correct information in there, moving to some form of wider foundational single sign-on architecture, that you have the right connectivity in place, and that you have the right threat modeling that you undertake and to understand what those risks are. And then really trying to re-architect those data platforms to separate the data and apply the right forms of security to it, having encryption in place, having the right kinds of governance and compliance in place as well is also very important. And as with many of the licensing and support aspects, it's really about having the right specialist inputs, making sure you have encryption in place, and that you implement what's called federation to make sure you only supply the information you need based on the activities that are being requested. and that you try to separate out those data sources, so you're only exposing the right amount of data, not all 20 years worth, maybe the last few years, all that's just required. Definitely consider some hybrid strategies if you have ultra secure data, and make sure that your devices and your IoT scenarios are also highly secure, and that you secure any form of innovation and transformation from the beginning. It shouldn't be acting as a conflict where you try to innovate and the platform, the security of the platform restricts what you can do. Finally, the last element really wanted us to look through really is around governance and cost. This is really a question of just making sure that you plan and control, and often comes down to organizational structures in terms of the way that this works. So very often most organizations don't understand what their current environment costs them. Therefore, it's very hard to know whether cloud is too expensive. But in a cloud environment, because everything is very easy to achieve, it can also be quite easy to actually run up very large bills on consumption if you don't manage and control that activity in a very granular kind of fashion. So many legacy applications and enterprise applications typically require lots of servers, so it often can be quite difficult to understand what's running at any one time. And very often people tend to oversize those servers for a particular application to thinking that it will actually make it run better. A lot of test and dev environments are not very well controlled, and often you have a lot of lack of a cost tracking process in place. So really, the strategies around this are around understanding the usage patterns, modeling the right reference architectures and SLAs to fit within that, and then limiting who can actually deploy what to where, making sure, therefore, you have control over who can actually spin up those environments, architecting things so that they're separate, so your test environments and your dev environments and your production environments don't have any reliance on each other, so you can manage them separately, and consolidating platforms where you can. So if you had 3 platforms in your on-premise environment, 3 different suppliers, maybe you can actually put those onto one platform in your new environment. Tagging them so that you can actually track which server belongs to which, and making sure you've got the right platform for the right size in those environments, and making sure the cost management of that is properly in place. Again, many of the planning activities and many of the monitoring activities we mentioned before and attitudes come into play here. It's automation, tagging what you have, making sure that you investigate any procurement or purchasing options that are available to you. So investigating what are called reserved instances, where you can buy X amount of servers over a time frame and then use them whichever way you want. Technology such as containerization and batch processing and getting the right size of those systems is very important. There are also a range of third-party cost management tools out there that allow you to actually track costs, and if required, you can implement recharging to actually charge back those costs and actually therefore bring that cost under more control and more focus. So covered a lot in this session really, and we're just trying to highlight what are the key areas that you need to think about and to focus on when trying to move those enterprise applications to public cloud. It's not always a straightforward process, but organizations like ourselves, version 1, we've developed a lot of skill sets there to help you deliver that. We're a very values-driven organization, and we're very much focused on delivering customer success and customer benefit through what we do. So we're very keen to work with you and understand how we can help. We have a strong financial position, and we're got a strong history of doing IT transformation, and we feel that we have some good differentiators compared to some of the other organizations out there, particularly in this space around moving things to cloud environments from on-premise or from private cloud. So very happy to have any conversations that you wish to have. We have a range of expertise across the cloud environment. We're ISO 27001 certified. We're Azure, Oracle, AWS partners as well. So we feel we can bring together a number of different skill sets and elements that may help you in your migration of your enterprise applications to public cloud. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Apologies for the slight overrun in time, but hopefully that was useful, and hopefully that gave you some pointers as where to look. If you do have any questions, please forward them to info@version1.com. Very happy to pick up on any questions and any issues that you might have, and happy to have those onward conversations. So thank you very much for your time.